So the kingdom without the king. Fascinating title. Now, as you know, we're following through the themes of this book, The Air That We Breathe. And the basic premise of Glenn Scrivener, who wrote it, is that in an increasingly post-Christian society, society still values, maybe in some ways even more so, the Christian values that it's inherited from Christianity, but doesn't want the Christian story, and certainly doesn't want the Christian king. Hence the title, The Kingdom Without a King. Now, if you think back to 2014, and actually, I promise you tonight we're not going any further back than that. Oh no, we might briefly visit the 60s, but not for long. I say that because those of you who came to the last one I did, yeah, I was given the subject of busting the myth of the Middle Ages, and I think one or two people, that was maybe a year or two too far back. So anyway, this is where we are tonight. The big impact events of 2014, what were they? Well, I can think of several, but possibly the big impact event that directly affected more lives for a long time was the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. I guess all of us will have forever in our minds those pictures of a seemingly indifferent white police officer kneeling on the neck of a black man and paying him no attention whatsoever while he gasped out 27 times, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," until he really could breathe no longer. And even when at the crowd's insistence, another police officer checked for a pulse and couldn't find one, Chauvin, the officer in question, did not move, but remained kneeling on that man's neck. There followed thousands of protests on 5 continents, at least, and taking the knee became an established part of major sporting events for the next 8 years. I'm a fan of Formula One. If you know the result of today's race, don't tell me. And right up until 2022, the drivers were still taking the knee before the start of every Grand Prix event. President Joe Biden said that Floyd's death was having a greater impact than the death of Martin Luther King in 1968. That's our visit to the 60s finished with. That was probably an overstatement, but not by very much. Now, the main premise of this book is that we assume that our modern values, our modern Western values, are somehow obvious, natural, and universal, but that actually history tells a different story, and that in fact they have been uniquely and overwhelmingly shaped from the Christian story. The book aims to show that it is the Christian revolution that has shaped our world and shaped the values that society holds dear. The air that we breathe flows from the life and person of Jesus. And when you look at those pictures of George Floyd, it's hard not to think actually of Jesus. And you know, the description in Isaiah 53, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. And there was strong reminders there underlying all of that of the, I lied, we're going back to the 19th century now, apologies, of the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century. Now, I don't know if you know this, but the emblem of the abolitionists was actually a medallion made by Wedgwood, you know, the potter. And it showed an enslaved black man kneeling and asking, "Am I not a man and a brother. And people were very quick to make the link between those two things. Now, in 1965, Martin Luther King led many protesters in prayer as they were about to be jailed. And all were kneeling. The question is, who were they kneeling to? Now, the point of these two illustrations I've used is that two ideas are closely linked. The assertion of the equal value and dignity of every human being, and that's really gone all the way through this book. The equal value and dignity of every human being, and humility before God, from whom that value and dignity comes. Now, in the Black Lives Matter protests, the first idea was plain: the value and dignity of every human being. Though I'll be honest with you, I did have one problem with the slogan. I think Black Lives Matter. Well, yes, they do. But does that mean that non-black lives don't? I personally would have wanted it to say Black Lives Matter too, because that really would have said that it's actually everybody of any colour and background that matters. But that's kind of a small thing. But the value and dignity of every human being was plain there, but the second was not. We were kneeling for someone, George Floyd, but we weren't kneeling to someone. And I think most people would have had no idea what kneeling really meant, and probably would have thought they were kneeling simply because that's what the police officer did. And they were just kind of giving a reminder of the event. But I think there's a big problem when you separate these two things out, so that you have a Christian-based reaction to the event, but you don't have a Christian-based answer. You don't have a Christian-based place to go to from there. Okay, we're kneeling to protest against that. I'm glad every person that now did it, but nothing about where that actually goes to. Now, in the protest that followed, many actions, like remember the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. He was a well-known trader in the city, but made a lot of money, but a very large part of it on the back of slavery. So some people went and toppled the statue and threw it in the dock. And you can kind of understand that. A bit like I always had a bit of sympathy when the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands and somebody went and chucked a tin of corned beef through the window of the Argentinian embassy. You can kind of understand the reaction. But what right had they to do it? And what about the rights of others? Keir Starmer, you might have heard of him. I think afterwards he became quite famous. He wanted the statue down, but following a democratic process, not the precipitate action of a few. And again, his point was that every life matters. So presumably all the people of Bristol and their view of the statue mattered, not just the ones that had the idea of pulling it down. But we might say, well, okay, so perhaps it's true, and we've looked at it over a number of weeks now, that Christian values really do still underlie what is best in our society, and it is Christian values that all of us are actually appealing to. But isn't really Christian influence over in the West? Are we not, as I said earlier, a post-Christian society? I don't know if you heard of a man called Dr. David Macareth. In a job interview, David, who'd been a doctor for 30 years, with a very good reputation, when he was interviewed for a job, he wanted to reserve the right to, this is his words, quote, not to refer to a 6-foot-tall bearded man as madam, end quote. And at his interview, he expressed this, and he expressed his Christian conviction. And when he was not employed, he claimed discrimination because he had made known in the interview that his beliefs were based on Genesis 1:27, the verse which has actually underlined this book and I think come out in nearly every talk. No, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, the foundational verse of Scripture, which Christians have always said is what gives real value, meaning, and dignity to every single human being on earth. And it was on the basis of that. But the judge ruled that verse was incompatible with human dignity. That's a quotation from his summing up. So to the judge's mind, which I think would be reflecting quite a lot in modern society, he didn't see that verse as giving value to every person. He only saw it as limiting the rights or the expression of one person. And if your view wants to limit that person, then you're out. And so he lost the tribunal. He did not get the job. So this is where we get really right to the heart of tonight's theme. In Christianity, the claim is that we all have equal rights to sit at the same table. That every single person totally equally can sit at the same table and be worth the same as every other person. And actually that is a high worth and a great value given by God the Creator and supremely underlined in the death of Christ on the cross for each and every one of them. The modern goal is not to have everyone at the same table with an equal right to be there. Increasingly it is for all to have the right to climb as high up as possible on the personal ladder of their choice. So instead of being collective and mutually respective, it's actually individual and competitive. In essence, the idea is that anyone who cannot do or be exactly what they want, irrespective of the effect of others or society as a whole, is a victim of oppression who must be championed and compensated. So we take our eye off the humanity as a whole or society as a whole, and we focus on the individual who feels aggrieved. And of course that just leads to more and more people having more and more reasons to feel aggrieved. And somehow it seems that their reason for being aggrieved, which you mustn't look at too closely, somehow trumps the right of the people around them. So this is why we talk about and he talks in the book about the kingdom without the king. I think modern society wants values, needs values, and broadly speaking still holds true to some of the core values of Christianity. In fact, in some ways, I don't have time to go into this, but I would say in some ways, modern society has expressed Christian values rather better than the church has through many generations. You can pick me up on that later if you want. But the values of the kingdom without the rule of the king is really a boat without a rudder. Still powerful, but adrift on an open sea and out of control. And in many ways, I do think that is how Western society can be depicted. Now, to be honest, I'd never thought of that until I started preparing this. That picture doesn't come from the book. It came out of my thinking about this subject. But I do think it's where we're increasingly going, a powerful boat, but without a rudder. So it can go very fast, but it can't reach an agreed destination and may actually simply capsize itself in the process, rudderless. You see, the first in the series was compassion. Now, when compassion is divorced from the Christian story, it risks degenerating into collective victimhood. When sexual consent is divorced from the Christian story, it risks reducing sex to something less than the Christian vision, not something more. So when we look at these Christian-derived values, which Western society is unquestionably, I believe, built on, the values of the kingdom without the rule of the king, as I said, is a boat without a rudder. So consider equality. Once pity for the undeserving was seen as a weakness, and in many parts of the world and other cultures still is. But we would call it, and our society would call it, a virtue. Consider consent. Once powerful men could possess the bodies of whomever they wished without restraint, control, or even criticism. Now we name it for the abuse that it is. Consider enlightenment, another of the themes that we've looked at in this series. Once education was only for the rich and powerful, now we consider it necessary for all. And we could carry on in a similar way for all the subjects that have been looked at over these past 8 to 9 weeks. So where is the problem? Can we not free Christian morality from the shackles of religion? I would say not without destroying it. Not without destroying it. Now, someone that I've never been a great fan of, the philosopher Nietzsche, who once proclaimed the death of God, actually saw this. In that book, The Death of God, he says this: people will inherit the concept of guilt, sin, and shame, but be without the means of redemption which Christianity also offers. So you've got the guilt, but you can't have the forgiveness. Who is there to forgive? This is the problem. We become increasingly individualistic, increasingly competitive, increasingly judgmental. And you only have to look at the internet to see that. On the internet, we issue death threats to anyone who disagrees with us. You know, the amazing thing about so much trolling that goes on is that the offence that they're complaining about would probably seem to, in many ways, fairly minor. And they cannot see the irony of threatening to murder someone because they've disagreed with somebody on a particular social point. But that's where it takes you. We issue death threats to anyone who disagrees with us and cancel anyone who does not hold to the current and constantly changing idea. So whatever the issue of the week is, everyone must polarize on it. And you're either absolutely right or you're wrong and you get death threats and are cancelled. As Johnny Cash once said, they want the kingdom without God in it. It may seem attractive to be answerable to no one, but then equally there is no one to forgive and to restore us. There's no grace in such a system. Once condemned, you are condemned forever. And we've seen a lot of high-profile people, some we probably respected greatly, fall from grace. The problem is, there isn't a way back to grace. And that however we may be horrified at what these did, and I'm not going to mention any names this evening, we surely believe that there is grace, there is redemption. Christian morals have always been based in the story of God's interaction with us, supremely in Jesus. It's not moral-based, but personal. Not legal, but relational. I'll close with a few verses from Psalm 130. If you, Lord, kept a record of our sins, and the internet is very good for that, isn't it? Every sin is recorded forever there. If you, Lord, kept a record of our sins, Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, so that we can, with reverence, serve you. You see, the values of the kingdom in some ways don't really help us. They only show we can't live up to them. We actually need the forgiveness and the indwelling power of the King. Thank you. Now, some questions will appear. We've got roughly 3 groups here. Perhaps some of you on the second row would like to join one of these. And now, you don't have to take these in order. You can choose which questions you take, whether to spend a lot of time on one or time equally, and send through any questions or thoughts that you would like us to look at together for discussion in a few minutes. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Should we come back together? And please do be sending in your questions on the Slido. Great job, Derek. Someone's written in. That was me. I did actually write the other question as well whilst you were speaking, Derek, and then you kind of answered it actually, but I don't know. Well, just whilst you guys are sending in questions, we'll maybe cover this one. Is society becoming more moralistic and religious in quotation marks, but without God and therefore lacking grace and forgiveness? I mean, you think you answered that.
That really was my conclusion, and in some ways I think the inevitable conclusion, because we are moral creatures at heart. I think Paul talked about the awareness of God in every person. The moral compass, the conscience. What is known about God is plain to them. He says this is people who never heard about Jesus. It's plain to them. So we are moral creatures. We were made in the image of God, who is himself a moral being. So, if you take out grace and forgiveness, you are only left with condemnation.
I think there's definitely, I feel like I've seen a shift though, where by maybe in the early 2000s there was almost, and maybe 90s, there was like this kind of sense of apathy towards a lot of questions about life, and also just like hedonistic, just like seek joy and pleasure and who cares about anything else. And like that has really changed. Like people, like it used to be okay to say a lot of things that were never okay to say, and no one really cared. And that's just not true anymore. And it like the pendulum has felt like it's swung the other way, and there is so much moralism in the world. And obviously some of it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Some of it's good, but then because it's lacking that grace and forgiveness, it feels like it also has this potential to be a very toxic environment. Yeah,
pendulums always swing, and they come back. Or as in this chapter in the book, he talks about tides going out, but tides that go out do turn and come in again.
Yeah, that's right.
Just right now, I didn't say that in the group, but looking at the first one, I think, could I say that the Pharisees were like that, very moral and religious, but yet Jesus didn't agree with their thinking. It was a problem, and then they think they were a condemnation.
Yes.
It becomes something condemnation.
Yes, you see, people of an earlier generation that tried to do without Jesus as Son of God and Saviour, and wanted to just portray him as a great moral teacher. Now, you often used to hear in academic circles, in academic programs, yes, Jesus was a great moral teacher. But if that's all he was, he wasn't. You see, before Jesus, the Jews already had the law, the Ten Commandments. Do not steal, do not murder, do not commit adultery. Now, they already had all that. Jesus came along and said, you have heard that it was said of old, do not murder, but I say to you, whoever hates his brother from his heart has already murdered him. You've heard that it was said, do not commit adultery, but he who looks lustfully on a woman has already committed adultery with her. So, Jesus came into a world that had not been able to keep the moral standard it was given, and ramped it up. So clearly not because he was saying to people, okay, now you've got to get even higher, but to actually show the impossibility of it, and therefore the necessity of forgiveness and grace. And the truth is that the only truly innocent person is Jesus. Now, for understandable reasons, very little was made in the press of George Floyd's criminal history and convictions. And you can understand that because certainly nothing that George Floyd had done in his life deserved what happened to him. But he wasn't innocent, and none of us are. But Jesus was.
Yeah, that's good. I think kind of maybe leads into the next question, just some of the thoughts I had, which was, is the speed and rise of identity culture actually drawing people to the church and to Jesus? And I really do believe there is a unique place for the church in the middle of all of this, and the particular that tension that we were just talking about. And maybe we'll come back to the identity culture side of this in a minute, but particularly the tension that there is between striving for moralism, but without God, becoming a very kind of actually quite a toxic environment. Whereas the church is uniquely positioned in which we are a community that believes wholeheartedly that anybody and everybody is welcome. It's the vilest offender truly believes, and you can walk through those doors as the person who is the most. A sex offender or a murderer that's come out of prison. Literally anybody can walk through those doors and be welcomed as they are, and yet we also have this the highest possible ideal of moralism, of holiness, and believe that actually that is possible. Perhaps not in this life, but in eternity future. But certainly transformation is possible and change is possible. And that we, hold those two things together through the means of grace. And that's such a unique space in culture, because there's not really anywhere that's like that exists anywhere else.
Yes, there are things that only the gospel can do, and only the person of Christ in the gospel can do. I was once in South Africa, in Pietermaritzburg, and I was invited into a prison. And the wing that I was invited into to speak to, they were all lifers. These were men, and we had about 40 or 50 of them in this room, were all men who committed the absolute worst of crimes. South Africa abolished the death penalty in 1995, and these men, a lot of them would have suffered the death penalty had it still been available. It wasn't, but they had life imprisonment without parole. No, there was no hope for those men. That rather dingy prison, not the worst in Africa I ever went into, but a pretty dingy prison. That was the rest of their life, the whole of their life. And I don't know if you've ever been hugged by 40 murderers in one morning, but there was a Christian meeting there, and I went to speak at it. And I think in some senses, the purest worship I've known was there. They had nothing to get. They weren't going to get parole early if they pretended to be converted, which can happen. They had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. Well, they had nothing to gain but Jesus. And they'd found Jesus. In fact, 4 more men were converted that morning. And where Jesus says there's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repents, over 99 who need no repentance. Well, I saw that morning, the joy in that place when those 4 men came forward, knelt to confess Christ. I've never known a meeting like it. Now, at one point I was alone in that room with those men. They could have killed me, and what could anyone do to them? They'd already got the highest penalty the law had. They could have done anything. But they were all kneeling and worshipping Jesus. And I truly believe that only the gospel can do that.
You could see the angels all around you, protecting you.
Oh, I don't doubt that either.
Yeah. I think that same principle extends to all sorts of other things as well. And so the question saying, is that the rise of identity culture actually drawing people to Jesus? And I think there are certainly cases where people are seeing the bankruptcy of identity culture. Some of you are nodding. I'd love to know why. If you've got examples, then you might do. But I think there's so many situations in the world right now where we're saying that we can't actually kind of manage our way out of these things, and there are competing ideas that we feel like are really important. So without trying to get too political, like immigration being a classic one, what is the solution to that problem? Literally, there just isn't one. There isn't a solution to that problem. And so many other problems in society, obviously the budget's just come out this last week, hasn't it? And a lot of people are very critical about it, etc., etc. But I'm like, well, what are you supposed to do? Like, it's just, you know, almost impossible to think how do we kind of manage our way out of some of the problems that we are seeing and facing in society at the moment. And kind of a lot of it is being driven by that rise of individualism and sense of isolation, which is partly what's driving the housing crisis. And like so many problems kind of root their way back to that same issue. I need to kind of think about that a bit more. But I do think that it's kind of like driving people to a point of questioning things. Like, was this really a good idea? Like even the kind of economic situation, because a lot of the kind of rise of individualism basically was a function to drive consumerism. So like, how do you kind of self-identify? Pretty much by buying things. That's how you create an identity, was by purchasing items. And so in a world where that's kind of not really viable anymore, then it's not as easy to actually construct your own identity anymore, just from a purely economic sense. So then you're just kind of scrabbling around thinking, well, what else? You know, I don't feel like I can be myself anymore. I was at another church this morning listening to somebody sharing a testimony of how she had this lady was sharing publicly about how her life had basically fallen apart and she'd ended up in debt. And she used the expression, I felt like I'd lost myself. I didn't know who I was anymore, because she'd lost everything. And obviously there's a foundation of which we stand in Christ, that, you know, actually, whether, you know, in need or plenty, whether I've got loads or I've got less, or, you know, whether I've got food on the table or not, I can do all things through Christ. In him I'm able to face everything, because I'm standing on this solid foundation. And I think that's a very unique thing. And I think as people get to that moment of, I don't know who I am anymore, they inevitably begin searching for something else. Yeah, has anyone got any other thoughts on that?
Interesting, because this morning sermon at Glaston Free Methodist, where I got, it was about Matthew 6:33, seek the kingdom of God first. And so you're not living on the things that you have, you know, the money or whatever. Don't become one with your money, with your possessions. Because imagine if everything goes in one day, and then, you know, for example, the Lord tells you tomorrow morning, that's it, I'm going to take everything off you. Well, what's your mindset going to be like? What are you thinking right now? Are you ready to embrace this idea? Or, and you say, okay, Jesus, I surrender anyway, everything to you, so will you remain in peace? So that's very interesting correction. Wow.
Yeah, it's
that's
true.
very good.
So when Derek saying about the prison, and they're saying there's no way out for them, that is basically what the world has become. But like if you do something wrong, there is no way back, and that's I think why people are coming to church, because it's the only thing that gives you a way back. Because like socially, you've got no chance. Once you've said something wrong that the masses disagree with, you're cast out. That's it.
And the study of the history of revivals shows that one of the common factors you see before revivals, because revival is in the end a sovereign act of God, but there are certain common factors, and one of them is the point where society becomes sick of itself and sick of sin, and wakes up and says, we cannot go on like this. And yeah, I think you're right, there are signs that is happening.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like we're increasingly, even on Sundays, just seeing people come through that are expressing something of that, saying, you know, I have experienced something of an existential crisis, and I've never been to church before. Can you help me to learn how to pray, or those kinds of things?
There's just like so much in the world like that's so fake, or that you can, like, even just like TikTok. Like, you're on one video and it has this point of view, and you're like, oh yeah, that's pretty good. And then you scroll to the next one and you're like, oh, that's also pretty good. And then, but then there's something that's like AI and that's fake, and then everyone's like, oh, I don't know, this is just a very specific example. But like, I think people are searching for like truth, not just all this, like, there's so many different things going on, it's like chaotic. And like I was saying to these lot, like my friends are not Christians at work, like they're in church, they've never really gone. But I was saying to these that like they love the fact that we have a group of friends that all collectively sort of think the same and have the same sort of values at church, and they love the fact that we have a pastor. Because if I say to my work friend, "Oh, I'm just going to speak to the pastor tonight," or like I'm texting you or whatever, they're like, "What? Like I need that." And like I know that's not God necessarily. They're not. Like, I'm not saying I'm talking to God. I'm talking to the pastor, but. Although pretty close, Jim.
None of us thought.
Where is this going?
I mean, I'm not like saying. I'm not sitting there like I'm just praying like I'm going to talk to pastor. And they're like very jealous of that fact.
Yeah, because they recognise the need for someone and something beyond themselves. And that's the first step to looking for that someone or something.
Sorry, Russ. You go.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I was wonder whether it's like sort of the journey for people in terms of kind of identity and whatever like the hook is for them, whether it's like clothes or music or football or whatever. It's like I just feel that modern cultures and mostly technology, it's just made it like so easy for people to do that journey really quickly. So when I think when you're younger, when I was younger, you know, say you were really into fashion, well, you'd save up, like you pocket money or whatever, and then you get that one thing, and then in a few months you might get that other thing. But that now, you could get like, I don't know, 10 wardrobes through Vinted in a few weeks, and then you're like, oh, right, well, what's next? But you can do that in a load of different like disciplines and areas, can't you? So I wonder whether that is the thing that's, because you can do those worldly material journeys so quickly.
Yeah, that one.
Then it's either like, well, that either gets you to a point where you're disillusioned and you've got that existential or mental health type issue, or you search for. And
I think for many people now, the materialist lie is being exposed, because how come that the idea was that if we got all this extra stuff, all the problems in our lives would disappear. Now that people have all that extra stuff, and mental health crises are constantly on the increase, and the demand for mental health services are on the increase. So, all the things that people thought would bring them satisfaction and peace of mind clearly are not doing that. And I think it's very arguable that the simple unified societies of a few generations ago were actually much happier places. People knew who they were, they knew where they fitted in. Life was at a kind of pace that was manageable, even if it was tough. And they had all the common values, that usually based around the church, that held them all together. So people had that sense of, I know who I am, I know what I am, I know what I do. And they could find their peace in that. Whereas we've got such a fragmented society that people can't find that anywhere anymore. Except, God willing, here.
Yeah. Final question. How do you wrestle with Christians? Just leave it there. How do you wrestle with Christians also becoming judgmental and losing grace? Tricky.
Yeah.
Take them down.
Perhaps the saddest thing is when Christians lose Christianity. And when I was preparing this, I was thinking, well, last week I was on holiday in Croatia, and one of the things I was reading was, I don't know if the name Jerome K. Jerome means anything to any of you. He wrote one of the funniest books in English literature, The Three Men on a Boat, not to mention the dog. But I was reading his collection of short stories, and he tells a story of a man, a very happy-go-lucky, he's a bookmaker, frequently in the pub, but he was actually the most warm-hearted, kind, generous person. And then he gets religion, and all of that falls away, and he becomes more narrow, more bigoted, less generous, more judgmental. And I thought, well, yeah, the tragic thing is, I can well imagine that writer actually knew someone that went down that road, and often the church has. The church has gone into judgment rather than into grace. And to be honest, the world loves it when we do, because they when they say all Christians are hypocrites, actually they know it isn't true, and all Christians are not by a long way. But it makes them feel better. They don't actually want to believe that genuine Christianity exists in genuine Christians, because then they would have to face up to their own situation. But certainly one of the major things that keeps people from Jesus can be Christians, or at least people who regularly attend a church, and whether they really know Jesus is perhaps another matter. The church throughout history has been very good at hiding Jesus, and that's tragic. But I think it's true, especially in medieval times, but in later times too. And it seems that the church always starts with the gospel, and then it degenerates into kind of organizational Christianity and legalism, and loses that sense of the person and presence of Jesus. And that's a tough thing to come up against.
I think that because of the time that we are living in, there is a sense of which actually also the church returning to the gospel. In a sense where actually I feel like that, I don't know, it connects with what you were saying, I think, Derek, but I think that judgmental spirit, I feel like the only place I feel like I really see it really is portrayed in the media. I think of actual people that I know who are Christians and in church, and I don't feel like I know a whole bunch of people that are especially judgmental as Christians, any more than, is kind of ordinary, normal, or I would be, because we've all got prejudices we're working through, haven't we? And it's important to own up to that. But I think on the whole, people are very committed to this idea of, like I was saying earlier, high standard of holiness, but anyone can walk through those doors, and that's important. It's not to say it's everywhere or everybody's perfect, but I think there's definitely a sense of that being the case. Yeah,
I think you very rarely see a proper portrayal of genuine Christianity in drama. The best one, in my opinion, actually is Father Brown. I don't know if you ever watched it. Father Brown, based on the books by G.K. Chesterton, who was a committed Roman Catholic believer, but having read pretty much everything he wrote, I'm convinced he was a believer.
Les Mis.
Sorry?
Les Mis.
Yeah.
That's quite a good example.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
We could sing it.
The thing in Father Brown, it's actually always about redemption. And whilst he's this very clever detective that solves these mysteries, always more important to him is the soul of the person, and looking to bring the person to redemption. And that's, it's probably something that's been consistent. I have no idea where Mark Williams personally is, but it is actually a very good portrayal of redemption and grace. And certainly the film Les Miserables, which is Christian through and through.
It is. Well, I think as well, like probably for all of us, like we have to trust the work of the Spirit to change people. Which I know this sounds obvious, but it's easier said than done sometimes, isn't it? I was thinking a couple of weeks ago when we had that mega service with 230 people or whatever it was, and there was a point where I just felt, and I was chatting to Steve Ellishaw afterwards, he was saying a similar thing. Just feeling a sense of quite overwhelmed. It was like, particularly one, a lot of people who we knew something of their story, a lot of people who'd come in as guests, never been to church before, but had very complex stories and a huge amount of things to process and walk through. And it's just quite overwhelming, thinking, goodness, where do we even start with discipling these people? And then a couple of Sundays later, we had an Eden service with Luke, who most of you will probably know, shared his story. So he's been coming to church, 12 months now or something like that, never been to church before, and it was just like saying, encouraging people, just keep coming back. And like every week, what I've encountered is like it's completely changed and transformed my life. And no one ever sat down with him and did like a discipleship program, but like just the week by week encountering church community and the Holy Spirit and the Word, and like God does the work. And that's not to say we should never be intentional with people or do that discipleship one-to-one stuff, but it's like, we have to trust him with people's stuff rather than always feeling like we have to fix everything or everyone, because that's often, I think, where we get into problems, isn't it?
I think one of the key ways that the evangelical churches in our country have had to change and are changing, and many have changed, is in that I think, when I look back to when I was younger, I think the churches seem to think that you had to kind of behave like a Christian to be able to come to the church and become a Christian.
Yeah.
Which is, to us, is obviously not true. But there was that kind of thing that, until you could fit in, you couldn't really come at all. Yeah. I think what we've learned is that people actually, we wanted people to believe before we would let them belong. And in fact, it has to be the other way around. We have to welcome them and let them belong so that they can come to believe. And that doesn't mean that we let unbelievers shape the church or lead the church. You don't put them up the front on a Sunday morning to tell people what God says. But you accept them. Remember they said of Jesus, and it was an out-and-out criticism, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Can you believe that?
And eats them. That would be more controversial, wouldn't it?
Sorry?
And eats them. That would have been more controversial.
It probably would, yes. In the Gospel according to Hannibal Lecter. But that's the point, isn't it? That was the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees. And until we actually welcome sinners and eat with them, they're not really going to have a path to redemption.
That's good. That's a good note to end on.